Bryan is the director of the Masters in Marketing Communications Leadership Program and clinical assistant professor of marketing at Nazareth College. He has been a digital marketing consultant for agencies and organizations for over 15 years. He currently teaches digital marketing, analytics, buyer behavior, and content marketing. Areas of research interests include digital transformation, automation, effective use of marketing technology, and effective use of marketing technology. That's wonderful. I hope I didn't mess anything up. So feel free to take it over, and put your bio in the chat as well for people who are coming in.
Great, thank you very much, Darlene. I appreciate it, and welcome everyone. I'm gonna, in a moment here, share my screen and go through our presentation. I want to let some folks know too that toward the end of the presentation, I'm going to open up and do a demo of some of the tools that we use in class. I think that's probably one of the best ways for us to really get into the effect of project-based learning in the classroom. I also want to start by saying that this presentation in particular is going to be looking at one example of a course at the graduate level, but I do believe that there's opportunity to take some of this work and make it elastic or agile to fit into an undergraduate experience as well. But the main reason why I'm coming at it from the master's or the graduate level is our students in this program in particular are always in a cohort and always part of a team. So it's probably one of the best examples I have of how project-based learning works really well in a digitally focused course, but also just it's programmatically how we're set up. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my presentation here really quick and share that with you all. Hopefully you'll see my screen here in just a moment. Okay, I think you should see it. So welcome. I'm going to be talking today about this idea of taking things directly from education into automation. It's sort of a pun, play on words, I guess you could say. But the idea here is that students are essentially given a project to work on for the entire semester, and then they'll build skills which eventually will be assessed in that final project to determine if they become competent in the material. And this works pretty much across all course types. I've done this in my buyer behavior, consumer behavior course. I've done this in my digital marketing course. I've done this in my principles of marketing course. It seems to work really well, depending on the type of topic you're going at. In particular, in this case, it's digital. So really quick, I want to start with a warm-up poll, and in the chat, I'm going to go ahead and put a link to my Poll Everywhere account. It's basically just a quick question for everyone here who's on the call. What digital tools are you using in the classroom? So I just want to take a minute and have you click through, and then feel free, you don't have to add your name, you can skip that part. But I want to get a read of the room and get a feel for the types of digital tools that we're using. That's going to be a big part of how we sort of go forward with this presentation in terms of what's available to us and then what we have to simulate in real time, and certainly what we supplement with course material, as well as what clients in particular give us in terms of their access. So I'll let that sit for a few moments. I will say that it's really important for me to get a good sense from folks if you're using any specific products in the classroom. You know, you can certainly reference any of the StuChem products if that's helpful, you know, any of the Google products or what have you. But I'll take a minute and let some folks put that through. I'm going to go ahead and pull this up and show it as we're going through it. So you should be able to see some of the responses in real time. I'm going to go ahead and let them scroll. So we've got some ads, we've got Google Analytics, We've got SEMrush. We've got any of the online trainings. So I would assume that's the Exceed LMS system or the Academy, Top Hat, Mimic Pro, Google Docs, Blackboard. Yeah, I was wondering if folks thought of like Blackboard, or we use Moodle, if those are digital tools as well. Google Trends, yep, for sure. Looks like we're using some Hootsuite probably for some of those social classes. This is a good mix, yeah. Trello, that's one of my favorite ones. In this particular case, we didn't use it this semester, but it's a good one for a lot of that sort of collaboration and thinking. Mimic Social, okay, good. All right, good. All right, so this is kind of what I thought in terms of what we would be using day in and day out in the classroom. What I want to do really quick is just kind of give you an idea of the course that we're going to be looking at for the presentation. And then from there, some of the materials that we'll be using, we have used in the course. One of the things I thought interesting, by the way, in the survey, and I haven't seen this a lot and I'm starting to experiment with it, but this semester in particular, I teach a summer capstone course and we're using Slack, which is a really interesting tool to enable the students to work through some of their thoughts sort of in real time. I think a lot of these students naturally will group text each other, or they'll get maybe a Google Hangout going, but because I administer Slack, I'm also available. I don't poke my head into any other channels unless they've invited me. I allow them to have that, but it gives them quick access to me as a professor if they're having trouble working things out. And I'm seeing some pretty interesting and really strong like student interaction in Slack. So that's one thing for sure that in this particular course that we're going to be talking about today, I would definitely have available for the project-based learning. But this particular course looks at media analytics strategy. So our program is primarily focused on marketing and communications from a leadership perspective. The students are put into teams and cohorts. They're given 2 courses a semester. Those courses offset each other. So for example, in our program, media analytics, soon to be analytics and data viz, that'll work with digital marketing. So they'll have those 2, digital marketing strategy. So they'll have those 2 courses together and they'll talk to each other. But in the context of the course itself, they're actually going to be focusing primarily on primary and digital media concepts that have a sort of a measurement component to it or metrics around it. The idea is to determine the effectiveness of their marketing and communications campaigns. And so students spend their time in this course discovering, defining, designing, and ultimately coming up with data-driven solutions based on consumer behavior and insight. So it draws heavily from their undergraduate experience in things like principles of marketing, buyer behavior, any of their general business courses, and elevates it to a more strategic level. So I always recommend for project-based learning, even if you're going to do one assessment at the end, and probably folks on this call here have done some project-based learning, or maybe you haven't, I'm not sure. We'll get sort of to that in the Q&A, but it's always good for me anyway to think about at the end of the semester, we typically do like a presentation or some formal assessment that is cumulative. Or you may do a midterm and then you may go from midterm forward and make it a little bit toward the end of the semester assessment. However you do it, I like to use 4 core buckets. It gives me a chance if I ever want to break these projects down into mini projects or sprints, as we call it in Agile thinking. So for this course in particular, we looked at, in the beginning, setting goals, how to transform data, how to make decisions with what you have available. It's really getting a good sense of the information that's in front of you. And then we shift pretty quickly to tracking behaviors, collecting data, using marketing analytics platforms. I know a lot of folks put in their survey, they use Google Analytics. That's a big one for us. We'll be talking in this particular presentation about some other tools we use. I'll get to those in just a moment, but this is really where we begin the process of sort of collecting in real time and then having it be time-based. From there, we get into evaluating and analyzing the data that we have, both through web user behavior and then whatever we know about the actual consumer in terms of their personal identifying information. So that's the beginning of us starting to synthesize, and then we essentially use all of this to optimize campaign performance and come up with some action-based items that the client or really the students in the project can carry forward. So we use a mixture of different tools to help deliver this content. Obviously, we use the student marketing analytics text. I know there's another digital marketing analytics text that's out there right now. I really wanted in this particular course, and this is important really for determining where your project's going to go at the end. Because this is a marketing communications and leadership program, I'm more interested in them understanding the technologies that exist, but really getting deep into demographic, behavioral, and psychographic information. I want them to have a good sense of user behavior and user experience for sure. But as you'll see in the example I'm going to be presenting in just a moment here, it's really important to think about if you're going to work with, say, like we did, an external client, or you're going to present a case or a scenario that's part of your project, to think about what's going to really be most meaningful and important for them to sort of learn as they go through. And so in this case, I really limited the content scope to stay focused on the project at hand. Like, for example, we didn't do deep dive marketing mix models. We didn't do a lot in terms of predictive, although we do discuss those. I did a lot of those as extra credit for these students. I have to remember that we're not a deep technical institution. This isn't a full-blown analytics program. So I do want to ramp up and ramp down where needed. So that's in particular how I used this text. We did use the simulation. I'm going to be really direct and honest. And I've had, one of the things that I love about working with StuKen is we can get on the horn really quick and talk. We had some issues with the simulation this semester, but we were able to extrapolate some of the data and some of the sort of case as it was built out and still run the simulation, even if the technology didn't work in our favor. But within a week we were back up and running, and it was pretty smooth. So I'm very impressed with the simulation. I don't use it as an end all, and I'll tell you why. If we're using the text for the students to get a sense of the material and to do their self-evaluation, and I'm going to cover this in just a moment here, I want them to have a gap, bridge the gap really from that point to the competency point, which is where they'll do an actual client presentation. And the best way to really do that is to simulate. I think we all can agree it's really hard to get access to real live data. So the simulation really allows us to practice with dummy data and then become a little bit more proficient in things like being able to, again, transform data, clean it, do some light cluster analysis. In this particular case, we did some A/B testing simulation, which we then did in real time. So it's sort of like, I like to think of it as, this is the practice really before we get into the game. And the game is really where I like to sit back and see if the students have really adopted these concepts. And the project is really the way that they adopt the concept, because it has that real life implication. And again, we'll get deeper into that in just a moment. Obviously, the Google marketing platform, I won't go into too many details, but I will say we were able to get live access to our particular clients' analytics data. So we were able to see how users were interacting with their website in particular, and their email content and other digital tools, social and whatnot. So that was really beneficial for the project-based learning. If you don't have the ability to do that, I will say we supplemented some of the limitations, which I'll talk about in just a moment, with a student-built, student-directed sandbox website. So the things that they're able to do, for example, with marketing platform, is really view client data, but they can't manipulate it, right? They can't put tags on the site without the client's approval. They can't run experimentation without the client's approval. In some cases, the clients don't even know how they have analytics installed on their site. But nonetheless, I still want the students to have the ability to really do these things, tactically apply their knowledge. And then we use HubSpot CRM. Now, the reason why in particular I want them to use a CRM in the course is they get to understand how to be sensitive or mindful of personal identifiable information. So it's not enough for us to look at web trends, right? For example, knowing what content they're looking at or what their interests are, as they come in from their browsing history, gives us kind of a generalized picture. If we think that funnel, it's sort of that suspect and prospect phase. But as we get a little bit deeper into really knowing these prospects and knowing these individuals and wanting to cater to their individual needs, we do want to have them understanding how to collect that data and be responsible with it, but also model a little bit of best practice thinking for the clients. In this case, which we'll talk about in just a moment, this particular client had a troubling CRM that didn't really do everything they were looking for. And so it allowed us to have those goal setting conversations really early before we launched into the project, which is another really key and important thing to look at. But nonetheless, HubSpot's great. They allow you to have free educational access. You just have to apply for it, and then you become a partner institution. And then they give you sort of the full suite to explore, and you can go as deep as you want, and you'll see how we use it later, or you can kind of scale back and use only the basic functionality. But it's been pretty good for us. There's a ton of documentation out there for students to engage deeper if they want to. In fact, a couple of my graduate students have pitched this. Not that we want to be product sellers, but they've pitched this to their upper management, the idea of a more robust CRM because of the ability to get the kind of data that they want out. So the way the course is designed, this is a pretty interesting, but probably not groundbreaking format. I want them to, so let me step way back and explain how our program is delivered. It's a hybrid weekend once a month program, whereas I have undergraduate courses that are hybrid, that are weekly. Nonetheless, the students have a period of time when they're online, when they're not together with their team. So that's the perfect opportunity to do things like reading, quizzes, assignments, all of that wonderful stuff. But it's intentional. So the reading and the assignments, blogs, quizzes, anything that's self-assessment allows those students to, in my opinion, go ahead and give back to me as the instructor how much of this they're really downloading and learning on their own. And it also gives me an early clue on in the project who's gonna step up, who's my type A, maybe who's gonna hang back a little bit, so I can coach them a little without getting too deep through their self-assessments. When we do get together for our seminars or our weekend, or even for the undergraduate students, whenever we're doing those weekly meetings, this is where we start actually putting a simulation together and letting them run the simulation together in real time. They'll do a lot of teamwork based on their reading assignment, quizzes, and ultimately they'll have in-class activities. All of this scaffolds up to what they give to the client. So I really, from a leadership standpoint, and frankly, from a business standpoint, I want them to have a good sense of their self in terms of how they contribute to the project or the work they're doing. I want them to understand how they do it for their team or their organization, and then ultimately how they do it for their customers, their clients, or really for the world, depending on where they're going to go off and work. So that's where they get into the process of advising, presenting, writing reflection papers on their work, so that it all comes together in the end with this project, right? So I assess them. For example, they do some assignments. Not going to bore you to tears with this too much. I'm sure you'll have access to this presentation or these materials later, and we're going to cover this. But for example, they do assignments like SMART goals or automation workflow, tag manager, and then they'll do blogs, or they'll have discussions, group discussions offline about the value of big data, how to determine and work with bias and cluster analysis, and then certainly to develop their own experimentation methodology. So really, this is the beginning of them doing the work or applying, or sort of applying the skills, and then discussing what they've sort of learned openly before they have to maybe go off and apply this in their work environment. And then their final project is really a client dashboard through Data Studio. So our client for this particular semester was the National Society for Experiential Education. I'm a member of the Membership Engagement Committee. I work really closely with one of the board members who works for our Center for Civic Engagement. And so, we had a discussion about particularly how the NSEE's values really align with the institution. And so what's great about this is because they're nonprofit, there's really low risk on their part to work with us in this project-based environment. But also we know that they're struggling right now, and they've been presented some challenges, particularly in the time of COVID, which we've all been presented with. So, there was a real problem statement early on around engagement. And this client in particular, as you can see, their mission statement is, the mission statement of this particular project in particular was that they wanted to seek to enhance web presentation and articulation of their institutional and sustaining memberships, meaning they essentially wanted to continue fostering the relationship with their members, right? But go out and attract new members from different areas. And so the problem statements that we sort of came up with early on, and in my opinion, when you're doing project-based learning, and particularly if you're going to work with a client or a case or a scenario, it's really good as an instructor. And unfortunately, I didn't have to manufacture this, but I've had cases where I've had to do this. We had to know the problem that we were trying to solve so that the teams had a goal, a common goal that they can work toward. So no question, COVID was big for them. They couldn't do in-person events. They were totally eliminated. They had to pivot really quick to digital and get a good sense of what was working and what wasn't. People aren't going to be paying full-blown membership fees, right, if they can't go to an annual conference or get all of the fanfare that goes with it. And I think a lot of organizations have had to pivot to this. But nonetheless, it's up to the value of digital, particularly the aspect of analyzing. In their case, they didn't have, even before COVID, they didn't have a really good sense of their ideal client or their user persona. So that was a key takeaway for us was, okay, we need to use some of this material that we're learning to go ahead and maybe define that for them. So we go through that sort of discovery, definition, deploy, optimize sort of cycle. And in this case, the students had a real clear understanding through discovery of those problems. They had generally, as an organization, felt there was lack of awareness of their website. In fact, one of the things that I'll show you when I actually do the live demo is where they have some opportunities to develop. I was going to show you a video of how the students actually presented this back to the client in terms of the project that they put together. But with technology, I think I'll just do the demo and sort of walk you through what they discovered. But essentially, they had a tough time understanding how their web and email content was really being engaged or used. And then even deeper, they really didn't have a strategy to generate leads. A lot of us in industry, who've worked in industry, know things like marketing automation workflows are all triggered off of lead generation or the ability to get people's information in your system with things like freemium or gated content or, things that don't ask for money right away, that allow you to nurture the relationship. There was zero strategy for that. So our students wanted to flex on some of their marketing communication skills they learned in other courses, but now use data and analytics to help support it, particularly digital. And then they had an antiquated CRM tool, which was presenting some real challenges to all the sort of statements above. So what did we have available to us? Well, pretty much everything was in Excel. I'm sure some of you have probably worked with organizations or have done studies on how folks have disparate information spread out in different spreadsheets, and it really makes it challenging for an organization to access the data. In this particular case, it was really clear that we needed a visualization tool, which is why we landed with Data Studio, to bring all of this stuff into one place that we would call an executive dashboard. But nonetheless, we did have some good information to work from. We had their current membership database as of the time we started the course. We had any of their satisfaction survey results, which was very interesting for the students to learn about the value of asking really good questions and where there's challenges when you don't do that and you need to get more data. They had a participant list from previous webinars. So that was a good indication of how they could augment their digital offerings and supplement some of their in-person activities, which were curtailed because of COVID. And then the actual recommendations from their committee on how to enhance their website. And then their actual web analytics, which we were able to get access to pretty early on. One of the things I didn't mention here, which I think should be really important, is The students were also given a report through Ripen. Ripen is one of those organizations that goes out and finds students to pair with companies. They had engaged in this process before, and that was really for them to go and get a feel for essentially what their message was like in the marketplace. So that report was given to the students and but they realized pretty quick there wasn't a lot of data capture in there. So it really supplemented it nice. There was this sort of research in terms of people's opinions, frankly, and the students' thoughts on what they should be doing, which we could now back up, support, or claim their claim with data, or frankly prove it to be not a good venture to go down. It was really up to the students to look at that research and determine how does that go forward. In their particular case, we also had an opportunity to sit down with the client early on. If you can't secure a client, but you want the ability to still simulate a project, it'd be really good to do some role playing. Again, if you have a clear understanding of what the problem statements are, students could read the reports, but inevitably, and one of the biggest reasons why we do it this way is there's still the need for human interaction, consulting, advising, or really the ability to kind of make sure that we're understanding the parameters of the project pretty clearly early on. So that's where students were given that report, which I mentioned before, but then they took that report and came up with their own SMART goals. And they wanted to run that essentially by the organization, which we were given the opportunity to do. So the students before the course, before our first weekend, and again, if you're doing a hybrid with undergrads or you're doing weekly, they have some time to ramp up. They can do their initial gut check or their feelings on how to develop these goals and KPIs, but then they were really able to run that by the client and get some feedback. So that opened up a really good dialogue. And I think what we all discovered when we did that was there were some big issues with incomplete or inconsistent data capture. So that allowed our students through the project to say, okay, when we go to present back to you, we need to be aware that we talked about some of the issues early on, and then going forward, we can sort of not get hung up on those issues. And we had a lot of that discussion, frankly, in our in-person classes, where the students essentially got frustrated with the lack of info. And then I think we all sort of had the ability to temper that and say, the client's okay with this lack of information, let's move on. So they weren't hung up on a certain area that caused emotional frustration for them. They could just move on to the next task at hand and keep kind of acquiring these skills as they go along toward their competency. So the project itself, this was great. The students actually put together a full-on Data Studio executive dashboard, which I'll show you in just a moment here, that looked at a bunch of different areas, particularly three that we wanted to focus in on, which was segmentation, targeting, particularly targeting audiences, and then using their behavior to understand how to target them further. And then obviously moving on to optimization, things like experimentation and A/B, all that wonderful stuff. So the students essentially had to come up with sort of their way that they would tell the story and give that back to the client through the lens of these kind of three big buckets. So as I showed you earlier, there was the sort of self-evaluation that moved to the team and the cohort, which then went to the client. We really built the project to align with that same methodology. So they had to really take their semester-long assignments, blogs, activities, and any teamwork they did and synthesize that and bring it together in one final presentation. So we started with them understanding the market. And that was really looking at a lot of their user data, which I'll get into in just a moment. Not their user data, their membership data. We then moved to web analytics and user behavior, which was understanding the consumer. What are those members doing or those folks doing when they're online or engaging with their material, be it through email, through social, which was very minimal, or through their website in general. And then from there, coming up with some ideas for how to experiment with content to meet those folks based on their needs and their interests, which was the idea of potential. This is really where they started to get into this concept of what we call organizational management or management consulting, where they use the data to help sort of manage up to the client things they could be thinking about doing. Low risk, low cost, but data driven, and really gave them the ability to sort of prove the concept. So how did we do it with segmentation and targeting? Well, I had some assignments, blog posts, experiences and whatnot that they were able to sort of engage with before they put together for their project. So for example, they had an assignment where they had to clean data. I think there's a data transformation, simulation, and mimic analytics. Yeah, there's two, there's basic and advanced. So they were able to do the basic, not the advanced. And that was a point of frustration for a lot of them because they were struggling with moving information out of the system, moving it back in. And so they worked through those frustrations, but it became clear later on how valuable and important that exercise was. And then we talked about once you have clean data and you begin this process of doing a light k-means kind of cluster analysis, what are you learning from the information? And are you biased already? Did you decide there was something you wanted to get out of this, and therefore when you did your cluster analysis, it proved back to you? Or were you simply allowing the information to tell the story? And then we went as far as to look at some of their deep goals. Like one of the goals, for example, the KPIs, not the KPIs, but the goals was to include more diversity initiatives in recruitment. And so one of the things that we learned pretty quick was there wasn't a lot of diversity in their membership profile. And so, were we looking for that? Were there things the organization did that didn't allow for diversity initiatives to be moved forward? A lot of questions came out of that, but it was a really good conversation. They did the in-class exercise with mimic analytics simulation with cluster analysis to sort of take their thoughts on if there would be bias and actually apply it and come back with some more discussion in class. So a lot of their assignments were really things I knew they could do on their own. Blog post was really what they could discuss in anticipation of the work. And then in class, they actually did the simulation. Their teamwork activity was, with all of this data now, and they have access to the real live data, could they come up with segments for email lists or defining their audience or even aligning or realigning their message? And so in their final project, they took membership data to tell the story about their current segments. They integrated that with the Data Studio dashboard, which I'll show you in just a moment. And then they presented some recommendations for how to go out and target folks. Again, we were looking, just as I mentioned before, demographic, behavioral, and psychographic information that would allow us to cater the message and really go after the market in a certain way. Then we shifted through the semester into web analytics and behavior. Again, all of this was to scaffold up to that final project, which was their executive dashboard. And so in this case, students, for example, they were able to do a tag manager assignment where, again, this gets into, and I'll show you in a moment the website here, but students really didn't have the ability to just go and start firing tags on the live website because that would ruin or really skew the client's data. So instead, we set up a sandbox website. It was really their blogging website on WordPress, and then let them go ahead and create all kinds of different tags and experiment and play around, fail. We had one exercise, for example, where the students forgot to put the right triggering mechanisms in, and it was firing all the time. So one student had 14,000 events versus another student only having 100. And so it opened up a really good dialogue in the class, but it allowed them through their blog posts on storytelling and creativity to really discuss how creative do you want to be with the type of information that you're going to be collecting, or frankly, the way in which that you want to track user interaction. And so again, a lot of the assignment blog stuff was to get them primed for really in the weekend. Okay, now that you've set these tags, you've looked at behavior tracking. In particular, they did page scrolling, how far down do people go, or video plays, start stops, all that wonderful stuff. They were then going back and retrofitting it. Okay, wait, do we have a goal for our website? For example, do we want 80% of the time people go 2/3 or more of the way down the page? That's how we know they're reading, right? Or they've watched a video 90% of the time, 3/4 of the way, meaning we know they're watching our video content, so that we have a better understanding of, are these tactics working? And so in their activity, then we were giving them both the client data and some Google Merchandise Store data, which I'm sure all of you have been able to load in your classes, sample data set, and begin the process of building their dashboards. So this is really where they're starting to understand how are these data sets coming together. You know, they've done their simulations to sort of test the theories. Now they're actually putting it together and getting ready for their final presentation. So in this case, they had to evaluate the audience, acquisition and behavior metrics in Google Analytics, but then they had to essentially build a full-on dashboard based on those metrics, and then explain how those go back to their SMART goals and their KPIs that they set way back at the beginning of the semester. So for example, if they wanted to make sure people were attending a webinar, or at least reading the details fairly regularly, and that was a goal, they had to go and explain how the data that they were presenting related to that specific goal. So this was the beginning of them, again, starting to bring some of that early thinking back to a tangible project deliverable. And then finally, we did the optimization and experimentation. So students were able to do some A/B multivariate tests in both through simulation and then in real time with some really interesting results. Again, we didn't let it run on their current website. We let it run on a CRM landing page that they designed for the client. So for example, one of the initiatives was to try to get more people to sign up for these regional meetups or these regional Zoom sessions that they were going to try to do as opposed to national. And so the landing pages were essentially A/B triggered off of where you were in the US, so that you had one page with consistent content, but you had different variants that could trigger. And they really dived into this piece because this was the beginning of them essentially using data that they started to understand to become competent with that data, and then also start experimenting with the way in which they would communicate. So we did the in-class A/B simulation, but then they did a specific Google optimized and HubSpot landing page optimization exercise, which I'm gonna show you here in just a moment. So their final project, they had to actually demonstrate A/B testing methodology. They actually had to show how they would build an A/B test, and then they had to relate the segments that they had defined in the first part all the way back to opportunities for ways to be personal with the information they gave to folks. And then they consulted with the client on ways they could do it. This one really landed with the client because they saw the opportunity here to take essentially data and do something with it, as opposed to just having information for the sake of having it. So the results. So the students did a demo of their final presentation on Zoom. I'm going to recommend, I think we've all had Zoom fatigue, right, in the time of COVID. But for this specific project, or digital projects in general, Zoom has been a pretty great tool to allow students to share their screen, hand over mouse control and let other people navigate through, as we've seen in this particular presentation, put links in that you can click to. So, they were given sort of a time-bound scenario where they only had 30 minutes in Zoom, and each member had a minimum of 5, a maximum of 7 minutes to participate with 4 team members. That allowed, if they were able to get it down, a couple things. They could be concise, they could explain the concepts really quickly. They allowed time for engagement with the client, which I knew they were going to have. But ultimately, they were able to keep themselves from rambling or adding too much information into the project. So what I want to do now is I want to actually bring up some of the tools that we used and allow you to sort of see the end result of their work. So here's an example. I'm hoping everyone can still see my screen here, but here's an example of some of the work that they did. So for example, there are 2 teams. There was the marketing maestros and the marketing magicians, which you'll see, I'm going to use them interchangeably, but their results were roughly the same. There were 2 different groups presenting 2 different dashboards with 2 different strategies for the organization. This particular group was very much interested in looking at developing regional, one of their SMART goals was to come up with regional conferences or regional outreach, and then diversify their population by targeting specific regions that had more diverse clientele or diverse members. And so really what they wanted to do first was just get a feel for, how did the membership distribute by region? And one of the things you'll see here was some of the data they collected didn't determine a region, meaning they didn't have complete data. And about 18% of their population, they really didn't know, where those folks were in the US. So they'd have to go back and clean that, and they explained it, which was great. From there, they moved on. So this gets into the kind of demographic stuff. From there, they were able to kind of get down to sort of the psychographic, what are the things that they're interested in terms of their special interest groups they want to be part of, what's the education level and how does that range in terms of what people have done as their formal study, and then what networks are they part of? Are they part of four-year colleges? Are they part of, again, here's a missing piece of data that we'd have to go back and get. Were they part of community colleges, so on and so forth. And so this sort of continues on with various components. For example, here's where your members live in terms of their physical address or where their institution is located versus their web browsing history. And we could see pretty quickly there was a lot of opportunity for international engagement because people were naturally finding the website. So perhaps the idea of national switches to global society for experiential ed, but nonetheless, it opened up some of those opportunities for discussion. The students continue to go on with, again, this is getting into web behavior versus the segmentation and targeting. And then they go on to sort of explain how they did tag manager implementation. So for example, they talk about the value of page scrolling, and they actually built page scroll tags that they launched and deployed on a, let me show you really quick here. It's a project website that I've created about 5 years ago that students keep adding blogs to, and they use it as a dummy website, and then they're able to tag this up. So for example, those page scrolling tags, as I scroll, are running right now in real time, and they were able to go back and evaluate that. So, and again, here's applying segmentation, targeting, and positioning to email campaigns. So it's relative in terms of coming back to what they're actually building in real time, but what they're sort of writing about and talking about. And so in their presentation, as you can see here, they were able to talk about the event tracking, but they weren't able to actually demonstrate it in real time with the analytics because it was on a dummy website. Same rule applies here with when they get into doing optimization. So in this case, they talk about, right, what is A/B testing. They talk about the ways in which it could be implemented and used effectively. But then they actually went in as far as to say, okay, so here's, for example, the landing page that we built as one of our assignments. Let's go ahead and run an actual A/B test on that in real time and show people how we're weighting things. For example, they did, 1/3 on the original. They varied the content once, and they varied it a second time and split it into thirds. And so they were able to really in real time show them, here's how we did it and what the implications could be for their organization. They go on from there really to talk about, again, so here's an example of the A/B, like here's a more personable take versus informative. This is for the people who, tend to read a lot. So for example, if their common behavior is to scroll pages quite frequently, they'll get this content. If they're more click happy, they would get this content. And students really loved the idea of being able to also back that up with heat mapping. This one had more engagement, whereas this one was more central, right? And so on and so forth. So all of this was built really in Data Studio. The beauty of it from there was they shared it directly with the client, and now the client has it and has carried it forward and uses it as part of their organization. And so that's one of the true values of this sort of digital skills to competencies through project-based learning is, at the end, if you do work with someone, or you have the fortunate to have the ability to work with someone, you can hand a lot of this stuff over and, if need be, continuously consult. In fact, our students sometimes work directly with these nonprofits after they're done in a consultative role. So there's benefit beyond just learning in the classroom. There's relationships and networks that are being created through that process too. So what I would like to do is conclude there and then open things up for questions if possible. And I don't know if should I stop sharing, Darlin, for questions?
You can do either way. If
Okay,
you want to stop sharing, that's
I'll
fine.
stop sharing.
Um, I'd love to see some questions if anybody has them. I know that in the beginning when you're talking about Slack, there were some comments about people using Slack or um, other types, and we use Slack here at Stupent, so it's
Yeah.
something that I'm familiar with. But I would love to open it up to any questions that people have. I think it's great to be able to see how you go about your own course. There's a question about, is Google Marketing free?
Yeah, I would imagine most institutions have Google Apps. If you don't, students in the past, when we haven't had full access to the apps, they've just created Google accounts, and then I organize them under an organization. But yes, the Google Marketing Cloud tools are mostly free. There's limitations, right? Like there's not comprehensive, you can't do comprehensive ad buying and ad serving, which we didn't really do a lot in terms of advertising data in here, because this organization doesn't do a lot of paid ads, although we did make that recommendation based on some other industry standards that we saw. But for the most part, it is free. I am going to be experimenting with the Google Nonprofit Marketing Immersion Program. I don't know if people have heard of this before, but if you get your students certified through Google Ads and you sign up to be a partner institution, they actually pair you with a nonprofit agency that you can run their ad campaign for about 8 weeks. So I'm looking at doing that, because that also gives you the ability, again, to go out and find these real clients and these real folks to work with. And that's totally free for you. And it's definitely free for the nonprofit agency that you'd work with.
That's kind of wonderful. I graduated recently, and I was actually part of that. I
Were
did
you?
I did that in one of my integrated marketing campaigns classes, and it was a wonderful experience to be able to get that
Yeah.
time and
Yeah,
actual money too. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, like so for example, this same cohort that I was just talking about is now in the capstone program, where they're doing this semester is consulting, but there's an undergraduate group from a different college that's running the ads that this group is helping manage. So they're actually applying their leadership skills, but there's a lot of synergy. That's one of the reasons why I was talking about like Slack, or we use also Active Collab, like again, tools that are available. Trello, I heard at one point, just to allow these folks to interact with each other. That's sort of truly how things are really going, as you're tapping into the talent base across the board, but giving everybody an opportunity to really delve into the project at hand.
yeah, I think they're absolutely wonderful opportunities, and I see that in the comments as well. We're going to be closing up soon, so if you have any questions, send them my way, or if you need to, I can direct them also to Bryan later. I'm going to put in the chat.
Can I just say one more thing, Darlin? I wanted to close, if it's okay. This fall, I'll be starting a podcast with another colleague from Bridgewater University. Her name's Adriana Boveda, and she's wonderful. The podcast is going to be called In This Case, and it's going to be a lot like kind of what we talked about here, but we're going to have the ability to sort of delve into cases and then apply marketing, specifically digital marketing concepts to those cases, and make those things available for faculty to use on in their classrooms as well. So be on the lookout for that. If anybody's interested, feel free to get in touch with me and I can get you more info. I was hoping to have a website ready, but couldn't get it done.
Well, that's a very exciting thing. I hope people follow you up on that, because it's great to have all different kinds of access to information. And I think it's great that you're starting a podcast. I put in the chat some links to the next sessions that are coming up at 11 Mountain Daylight Time, but I'll be in the room with Lisa Agazzino. But feel free to join those links. I'm also going to put one more link in the chat that is for anybody who missed it. We had I showed a little product launch hype video, and we're getting real excited for it. So I'll put that link back in there so you can look and find any more information about our products. But thank you, Bryan, and thank you to everyone that came. We're grateful that you spent your time here with us and able to hopefully take something today and be able to apply it to your classrooms. With that, I will close out and see you guys later.
Bye. Thank you.